Her pacemaker was ripped from her chest and left on the floor. Her security cameras were smashed to pieces. A thin trail of blood ran from her living room toward the back door of her Tucson home. And by the morning of February 2nd, 2026, Nancy Guthrie was gone. Not wandered off, not confused, gone. Nancy was 84 years old, a widow, a grandmother, a woman who showed up every Sunday to St. Philip's in the Hills Episcopal Church in Tucson, Arizona, the same congregation she had been part of for decades. She had spent years in administration at the University of Arizona. She raised 5 children after her husband Charles died in 1988, and she did it with the kind of steady, quiet strength that earns real respect from people who know you. She was not wealthy, she was not famous, she was rooted, known, and deeply loved. She was also the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, and that connection would eventually bring the attention of the entire country to her front door. But on the night of February 1st, 2026, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Nancy was alone in her home. Her pacemaker was keeping her heart beating, and her son-in-law, Tommaso, had just left via Uber after spending the evening with her. They had dinner together. According to his later statements, it was a routine visit. Nothing unusual. But what investigators pieced together in the days and weeks that followed told a very different story. Now, if you're new here, welcome. We follow these cases until we find the truth, not just until the headlines stop. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this story is far from over. When someone arrived at Nancy's home the following morning to check on her, what they found stopped them cold. The back door was standing wide open. The security cameras inside the house had been physically destroyed. Nancy's pacemaker, the small device implanted in her chest that regulated her heartbeat, had been forcibly disconnected and left on the floor. And there was blood, not a large amount, but a thin and deliberate trail of it leading from inside the house toward that open back door. For viewers who may not be familiar with how a pacemaker works, in a patient like Nancy, with her age and cardiac history, that device was not optional. It was sending continuous electrical signals to keep her heart rhythm stable. Without it, her heart could fall into a dangerous, irregular pattern within minutes. Whoever disconnected that pacemaker knew exactly what they were doing to her. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. Whoever had been inside that house either had a key or had been let in. And Nancy's dog never barked. That detail haunts everyone who has looked closely at this case. Dogs bark at strangers. They bark at anything that feels wrong. But that night, silence. Which means whoever came through that door was someone the dog recognized, someone Nancy trusted. Police arrived quickly. The Tucson Police Department secured the scene. The FBI was called in within hours, and almost immediately, the investigation turned toward the last person confirmed to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive, her son-in-law, Tommaso. He was not a stranger in Nancy's life. He had been married to her daughter Annie for years. He was 63 years old, an academic, Italian-born, by most accounts composed and intelligent. He also held power of attorney over Nancy's finances, legal authority to manage her bank accounts and handle her affairs. That kind of arrangement is common in families with aging parents, but in the context of what had happened inside that house, it raised immediate red flags. When investigators came to speak with him, Tommaso did not sit down for an interview. He did not volunteer information. He hired a criminal defense attorney and he went silent. Legally, that was his right, but publicly, it looked devastating. The FBI released doorbell camera footage showing a masked, gloved figure approaching Nancy's property in the dark, moving with precision, not panicking, not hesitating. Someone who knew exactly where the cameras were and exactly what needed to be disabled. Investigators estimated the figure stood between 5'9" and 6'1". Tommaso is 5'11". 3 ransom notes then surfaced, all demanding Bitcoin payments and claiming to have Nancy. Investigators quickly determined the notes were fake, sent by someone trying to exploit the tragedy for money. That person was later arrested. The notes were a cruel distraction that cost precious time. Meanwhile, Savannah Guthrie stood in front of cameras, not as a journalist, but as a daughter. Her voice broke. She begged anyone with information to come forward and took a leave of absence from the Today Show. The family offered a $50,000 reward. The FBI matched it. $100,000, and still nothing. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And through all of it, Tommaso said nothing. Then something changed. Investigators had been quietly gathering evidence the public knew nothing about. A traced phone call made at 2:47 in the morning. Text messages that mapped out Nancy's home, her routine, and her medication schedule in chilling detail. And a laptop search history that someone had tried to permanently delete 3 days before his arrest, and failed. All of it was waiting for him inside a cold, windowless FBI interrogation room, and what happened over the next 6 hours confirmed everything people had suspected from the very beginning. That footage has now surfaced, and we are going to take you inside that room. The room was small, intentionally so. A metal table, 2 chairs, a camera mounted in the corner that recorded everything, and across from the FBI agents sat Tommaso, composed, or at least trying to appear that way. His attorney had advised him to stay calm, to say as little as possible, to give them nothing they could use. What his attorney could not have prepared him for was how much they already had. Investigators did not walk into that interrogation room blind. They walked in with 3 separate pieces of evidence that, taken together, formed a timeline so specific and so damning that denying it would have required Tommaso to explain away his own digital footprint. And that is a very difficult thing to do when the FBI's forensic team has had months to reconstruct every move you made. The first reveal was the phone call. At 2:47 in the morning on February 2nd, 2026, roughly 5 hours after Tommaso's Uber car had dropped him at his own front door, his cell phone pinged a tower less than a mile from Nancy Guthrie's home. He had told investigators he went straight home after dinner. He had told Annie the same thing. But cell tower data does not care what you told your wife. It records where your phone physically was. And at 2:47 a.m., Tommaso's phone was not at his house. It was near Nancy's. There was a call made from that location. According to investigators, the call lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The number it connected to belonged to a man named Marcus, a former graduate student Tommaso had mentored, a man who had struggled financially for years and who owed Tommaso a significant personal debt. Marcus would later become a cooperating witness for the FBI. But in those early hours of the interrogation, Tommaso did not know that yet. The second reveal was the text messages. Investigators placed printed copies of the exchange on the table in front of him. Weeks' worth of messages between Tommaso and Marcus, beginning in early January 2026 and running through January 31st, the day before Nancy disappeared. The messages had been deleted from both phones. But deletion is not destruction. A skilled forensic team can recover deleted messages from a device's memory, and that is exactly what the FBI lab had done. The texts were not vague. They discussed Nancy's daily routine in specific detail: what time she woke up, which lights she left on, when she went to bed. They discussed her medication schedule. They discussed the layout of the house, including which entrance would be least visible from neighboring properties at night. They discussed the security cameras and what kind of equipment would be needed to disable them. And they discussed the pacemaker: what it was, how it functioned, and what would happen if it were disconnected. These were not the messages of 2 men having an academic conversation. These were the messages of 2 men who had planned something very specific for a very specific night. Now, it is worth pausing here to explain something that many viewers may not be familiar with. Under Arizona law, a person can be charged with and convicted of murder even when no body has been recovered. This is known as corpus delicti prosecution, which simply means that physical remains are not required if the totality of evidence, forensic, digital, and testimonial, is strong enough to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime was committed and that the accused committed it. Arizona prosecutors had made this argument successfully before, and with the evidence they were building against Tommaso, they were prepared to make it again. Nancy's body has never been found, but the case against Tommaso did not depend on finding her. It depended on what was already in his phone, on his laptop, and in the testimony of Marcus. The third reveal broke him. Investigators told him they had recovered the deleted search history from his personal laptop. Searches conducted on January 29th, 3 days before the disappearance, included specific queries about cardiac pacemakers and how they are calibrated, searches about what happens medically when a pacemaker is forcibly removed from a patient, searches about decomposition timelines in the Arizona desert, and searches about how long a person can survive exposure at night in temperatures below 40 degrees. Each search had a timestamp. Each timestamp was logged, and the deletion had been incomplete. Enough of the session data survived that forensic technicians could reconstruct it in full. Tommaso's composure did not hold. According to sources close to the investigation, he asked to speak with his attorney. The interview was paused, and when it resumed, the conversation had shifted from denial to negotiation. Marcus had already accepted a cooperation agreement. His testimony placed Tommaso at Nancy's property on the night of February 1st. His testimony confirmed that the plan had been discussed and rehearsed, and his testimony described a financial arrangement, a promise of debt forgiveness in exchange for helping carry out something that Marcus would later tell the FBI he had convinced himself would not go as far as it did. It went exactly as far as Tommaso intended. What Tommaso did not know, and what his attorneys had not fully anticipated, was that the FBI had been quietly watching the estate accounts since February 4th. Every attempted transaction after Nancy's disappearance, including 2 attempts to move funds from accounts Tommaso held power of attorney over, had been flagged and frozen. The $2 million inheritance he had counted on was never accessible to him, and the will revision appointment Nancy had scheduled for February 3rd, the appointment that investigators believe was the specific deadline driving his timeline, would have transferred a substantial portion of that estate away from Annie and toward Nancy's other children. He did not want her to make that appointment, and he made certain she would not. Annie Guthrie sat in that courtroom every single day of the trial. She sat behind the prosecution table. She sat across the room from the man she had been married to for years. And when the jury foreperson stood up and read the verdict aloud, guilty of first-degree murder, she did not visibly react. According to people who were in that room, she simply closed her eyes, just for a moment. Then she opened them again and looked straight ahead. That image tells you everything you need to know about what this case cost her. The trial lasted 19 days. The prosecution called 31 witnesses, including the FBI forensic analyst who reconstructed Tommaso's deleted laptop searches, the cell tower data expert who placed his phone near Nancy's home at 2:47 in the morning, and Marcus himself, who testified for 3 full days under a cooperation agreement that reduced his own charges from first-degree murder to conspiracy and obstruction. Marcus described in specific detail how the plan had developed over the course of January, how Tommaso had framed it initially as something that would never go all the way, and how by the final week of January he understood clearly what he had agreed to participate in. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that no body had been recovered, and that Marcus was a compromised witness whose testimony had been shaped by the terms of his deal with the government. Those are standard arguments in a case built without remains. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days before returning their verdict. Tommaso was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Marcus received 22 years, with the possibility of parole after 14, in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, described the crime as one of the most deliberate and coldly calculated she had encountered in her time on the bench. She noted specifically that the victim had trusted the person who killed her, that she had cooked dinner for him, that she had no reason, on the last evening of her life, to believe she was in any danger at all. Nancy Guthrie's remains have still not been found. Her family has not been able to hold a funeral. They have not been able to bury her, or mark a grave, or do any of the things that help people move through the kind of grief that does not have an end. That absence is its own cruelty, and it is something the sentencing remarks acknowledged directly. Now, let us talk about Annie. Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show after the trial concluded. She has spoken publicly about what the experience did to her family and what it continues to do. But Annie's position in all of this is something the national coverage has handled more gently, and it deserves to be said plainly. Annie lost her mother. She lost her husband. Not to death, but to a prison cell, which is in some ways harder because the person still exists, and the marriage does not. She has faced the public reality of being the wife of a man convicted of murdering her own mother. Whatever she believed about Tommaso during the investigation, whatever private doubts or defenses she may have held onto before the verdict, she ultimately cooperated with investigators and was never considered a suspect. But cooperation does not erase what she has been left carrying. She has not spoken publicly at length. That is her right. But she deserves to be seen as a person in this story, not only as a plot point in it. There is one more thing this case demands we discuss. Because Nancy Guthrie is not the only aging parent in America with a family member holding power of attorney. Not by a long way. Power of attorney is a legal arrangement that gives another person authority over your finances, your property, or your medical decisions. It is extremely common. It is often the most practical and loving thing a family can arrange when an older parent can no longer manage everything alone. In the overwhelming majority of families, it works exactly as intended. But the Guthrie case made visible something that elder law attorneys and adult protective services workers have known for a long time. Financial exploitation of elderly family members is one of the most underreported crimes in the country, and it most commonly comes from someone the victim already trusts. The warning signs are specific. A family member who discourages the elderly parent from speaking to other relatives alone. A family member who becomes unusually involved in financial decisions without transparency. A family member who seems more focused on the estate than on the person. Resistance to the parent updating a will or meeting independently with an attorney. These are not proof of anything on their own, but they are patterns worth paying attention to. Nancy had an appointment scheduled for February 3rd to revise her will. She never made it. But the fact that she had made it at all, that she had decided, on her own, that something needed to change, suggests that on some level, she was paying attention too. If you have a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, or a neighbor who is aging and who has given someone else authority over their affairs, have the conversation. Ask how things are going. Stay present. The people who are most vulnerable to this kind of harm are the ones who have been quietly isolated from the people who love them most. Nancy Guthrie showed up to her church every Sunday for decades. She raised 5 children after her husband died. She was rooted, known, and loved, and she deserved to die in her own time, in her own bed, surrounded by the people she had spent her whole life building a family with. If you have any information about Nancy's whereabouts or about this case, contact the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. Her family is still waiting. What do you think justice looks like when the person who was supposed to protect her was the one who took her?